More than 12 centuries ago, when Europe was divided among rival kingdoms and the North Sea remained a dangerous frontier, unfamiliar ships began appearing along the coastlines of Britain, Ireland, and France. They were long, narrow vessels, built from overlapping wooden planks. They moved quickly through rough seas, slipped into shallow rivers, and landed directly on open beaches. Along their sides hung painted shields, and beneath their sails stood warriors armed with spears, swords, and heavy axes. They came from the northern lands of Scandinavia, and in time, Europe would remember them as the Vikings. Among all the Viking names preserved in medieval stories, one stands above the rest. Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary warrior king who crossed seas, defeated armies, attacked wealthy cities, and fathered some of the most feared commanders of the Viking Age. According to the sagas, Ragnar began his life as the son of a Scandinavian ruler, but he refused to remain hidden in the shadow of his family. He sought danger, victory, and fame. He fought monsters, married warrior women, and sailed against kingdoms that believed themselves safe from attack. He supposedly raided England, challenged the Franks, and led a Viking assault against Paris. His name became connected with almost every quality admired in a heroic Viking leader. Ragnar was described as fearless in battle, clever in strategy, and hungry for glory. He was a ruler who rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. He was also a man whose ambition could never be satisfied. Every victory demanded another. Every conquered enemy created a desire for a greater challenge. In the world of the sagas, Ragnar was not simply a warrior. He was a man struggling against fate itself. Yet the most famous part of Ragnar's life was not one of his victories. It was his death. According to medieval tradition, Ragnar sailed to England with only a small force. His ships were lost, his warriors were defeated, and he was captured by King Ella of Northumbria. The king did not grant Ragnar the honorable death of a warrior on the battlefield. Instead, he ordered him to be thrown into a pit filled with venomous snakes. There, surrounded by serpents, Ragnar supposedly refused to show fear. As the snakes struck him, he declared that the young pigs would roar when they learned how the old boar had suffered. The young pigs were Ragnar's sons. When they heard of their father's death, the sagas claim that they gathered one of the largest Viking armies ever seen. They crossed the North Sea, invaded England, and brought destruction to the kingdoms that had allowed Ragnar to die. This army became known as the Great Heathen Army. Its leaders included men whose names appear not only in legends, but also in historical records. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Ubba, and perhaps Sigurd Snake in the Eye. It is here that history and legend become almost impossible to separate. Ragnar's sons appear to have been based on real Viking commanders. The Great Heathen Army was real. The invasion of England in the 9th century was real. The fall of Northumbria and the capture of York were real. Yet the man described as the father of these warriors remains uncertain. No surviving record written during Ragnar's supposed lifetime clearly describes a king called Ragnar Lothbrok, who performed all the deeds later attributed to him. Instead, historians find several Viking leaders, whose names and actions may have been combined over time. A warrior called Ragnar led a major attack on Paris in 845. Other Viking commanders fought in Ireland, England, and the Frankish kingdoms. Their stories may have traveled through oral tradition, changing with every generation until several separate men became one unforgettable hero. The detailed stories about Ragnar were written down centuries after the Viking Age. By then, storytellers were not simply recording history. They were creating heroic literature. Their audiences wanted dramatic battles, dangerous journeys, supernatural signs, proud kings, and tragic deaths. They wanted heroes who could connect the legendary past of Scandinavia with the real Viking conquerors whose descendants ruled powerful territories. Ragnar was the perfect figure for that purpose. His marriages connected him with shield-maidens, dragon slayers, and royal families. His sons connected him with England, Ireland, France, Denmark, and the Mediterranean world. His death provided a reason for the invasion of England. Through Ragnar, Dozens of stories could be brought together into one great family history. This does not necessarily mean that Ragnar was completely fictional. Legends often begin with real people. A successful Viking ruler may have carried a similar name. He may have led raids, formed alliances, and fathered important warriors. His real accomplishments could have grown larger with every retelling. A raid became an invasion. A difficult enemy became a monster. A political marriage became a romance with a shield maiden. A battlefield death became execution in a pit of snakes. The truth may lie somewhere between history and mythology. Perhaps Ragnar was one historical man whose life was heavily exaggerated. Perhaps he was created from the memories of several Viking leaders. Perhaps the name Ragnar became a title attached to heroic stories that originally belonged to different people. It is also possible that the father of the famous Viking brothers existed but was far less powerful than later traditions claimed. The uncertainty is part of what makes Ragnar so fascinating. With many historical figures, the task is to reconstruct a life from incomplete evidence. With Ragnar, the task is more difficult. We must examine why people wanted to believe in him. We must understand what his story meant to those who told it. To medieval Scandinavians, Ragnar represented courage, ambition, and the dangerous cost of pride. To the descendants of Viking rulers, he offered a heroic ancestor. To Christian chroniclers, he could represent the violence of the pagan invaders. To modern audiences, he has become the face of the Viking Age itself. But before we can search for the man behind the legend, we must enter the world that created him. We must travel back to Scandinavia before the great invasions, before Viking armies conquered kingdoms, and before the name Ragnar Lothbrok echoed across Europe. We must begin in the northern farms, trading settlements, and royal halls from which the Viking Age was born. Before the Viking Age transformed the political map of Europe, Scandinavia was a region of scattered farms, coastal communities, trading settlements, and competing kingdoms. The lands that would eventually become Denmark, Norway, and Sweden did not yet exist as unified nations. Authority was divided among local chieftains, wealthy landowners, and regional kings whose power depended less on fixed borders than on personal loyalty. A king was powerful only while others believed he was powerful. He needed warriors willing to fight for him, farmers willing to support him, and local leaders willing to accept his authority. He maintained these relationships through marriage alliances, feasts, gifts, and successful warfare. Silver, weapons, livestock, and land were distributed to loyal followers. Generosity was considered one of the essential qualities of a ruler. A leader who gained wealth could reward more warriors. More warriors allowed him to win more battles. More victories brought additional wealth and increased his reputation. This created a constant cycle of competition. A ruler who stopped expanding could quickly be challenged by a younger, more successful rival. Most people living in Scandinavia were not warriors who spent their lives sailing from one raid to another. They were farmers. They planted crops, raised animals, repaired buildings, and prepared for long winters. Their farms were usually organized around large wooden longhouses. These structures served as homes, workplaces, and centers of family life. Smoke from cooking fires filled the interior, while animals might be sheltered at one end during colder months. The Scandinavian household was more than a private family. It was an economic and political unit. Relatives, servants, hired workers, and enslaved people could all live and work on the same property. Survival depended on cooperation. Fields had to be planted, animals cared for, cloth produced, fish preserved, and tools repaired. Society was divided into different levels. Kings, aristocrats, and major landowners controlled the greatest wealth. Beneath them were free farmers, traders, and craftspeople. Free people could own land, carry weapons, participate in local assemblies, and defend their legal rights. At the lowest level were enslaved men and women, often known as thralls. Enslavement was an important but brutal part of the Viking economy. People could be captured during warfare, purchased in markets, or born into slavery. They performed agricultural labor, domestic work, and other difficult tasks. Viking raids were therefore not only attempts to steal silver and precious objects. Captives were also valuable because they could be sold across extensive trading networks. Scandinavian communities were connected through trade long before the first famous Viking attacks. Merchants traveled across the Baltic Sea and followed rivers deep into Eastern Europe. They exchanged furs, amber, iron, weapons, and enslaved people for silver, glass, silk, and other luxury goods. Scandinavian objects have been found far from the northern world, while foreign coins and materials have been discovered in Viking settlements. Trading centers such as Birka, Hedeby, and Kaupang became places where different languages, religions, and cultures met. Merchants from Scandinavia encountered Slavic peoples, Franks, Anglo-Saxons, and travelers connected to the Islamic world. The Vikings did not suddenly discover Europe at the end of the 8th century. They were already part of international systems of exchange. What changed was their ability and willingness to use organized violence on a larger scale. One of the most important developments was the improvement of Scandinavian shipbuilding. Viking ships were light, flexible, and extremely efficient. Their overlapping wooden planks created strong hulls that could survive open seas. Their shallow draft allowed them to move through rivers and approach coastlines where deeper ships could not travel. A crew could sail across the North Sea, enter a river, attack a settlement, and withdraw before defenders had time to organize. The ships could also be pulled onto beaches or carried across short distances. This gave Viking forces extraordinary mobility. The reasons for the beginning of Viking raiding remain debated. No single explanation is enough. Population growth may have placed pressure on available land in some areas, although this was probably not true everywhere. Political competition may have pushed defeated rulers and ambitious warriors to seek opportunities abroad. The expansion of European trade created wealthy targets. Improvements in ships made distant attacks more practical. Changes in royal power may also have played a role. As Scandinavian rulers attempted to control larger territories, some independent warriors may have left their homelands. Others may have raided abroad to gather the wealth needed to compete at home. Inheritance traditions could create additional pressure. A wealthy family might divide property among several sons, leaving some with fewer resources. For an ambitious young man, joining a raiding expedition offered a chance to gain silver, weapons, followers, and social status. Religion shaped this society, but it did not control every action in a simple way. The pre-Christian Scandinavians worshipped many gods and supernatural beings. Odin was associated with wisdom, poetry, kingship, war, and the dead. Thor was connected with strength, protection, and thunder. Freyr and Freyja were associated with fertility, prosperity, and power. Religious practices varied between regions and communities. People offered animals, food, weapons, and valuable objects at sacred places. Some rituals took place in halls, groves, wetlands, or temples. The relationship between humans and the gods was based partly on exchange. People gave offerings in the hope of receiving protection, victory, or good harvests. Ideas about fate were especially powerful in later Norse literature. A person might struggle against destiny, but could not always escape it. This theme appears repeatedly in the Ragnar stories. Ragnar pursues glory even when his decisions lead toward destruction. His sons attempt to fulfill the fate created by their father's death. By the late 8th century, Scandinavian warriors were prepared to take advantage of a divided Europe. Across the sea, kingdoms fought among themselves. Coastal monasteries held valuable objects, but had little protection. Towns and villages were often poorly defended. Local armies could take time to gather, while Viking raiders could disappear within hours. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 became the most famous symbol of this new age. The monastery stood on a tidal island off the northeastern coast of England. It was one of the most sacred Christian sites in the region, associated with St. Cuthbert and generations of religious learning. For Scandinavian raiders, however, Lindisfarne offered wealth, captives, and easy access from the sea. The attackers killed or captured members of the religious community and carried away valuable objects. Christian writers reacted with horror. They struggled to understand how such a holy place could be attacked. The raid did not create the Viking Age by itself, but it revealed how vulnerable Western Europe had become. During the following decades, raids increased in frequency and scale. Small bands became larger fleets. Temporary attacks became winter camps. Raiders became conquerors, settlers, and rulers. Somewhere within this period of expansion, the story of Ragnar Lothbrok begins to emerge. Whether he was one man or many, his legend could only have been created in a society where ships, warfare, trade, ambition, and storytelling were deeply connected. The Viking world had opened the road to England, Ireland, and France. The stage was ready for a hero to sail across it. The rise of Ragnar Lothbrok begins not in contemporary historical records, but in the world of medieval storytelling. By the time his adventures were written down, the Viking Age had already ended. Scandinavia had become Christian, kings ruled more centralized states, and the old warrior culture had passed into memory. Yet stories of the pagan past remained popular, especially tales about rulers who crossed seas, defeated enemies, and refused to surrender to fate. In these stories, Ragnar was born for greatness. He was often described as the son of a king named Sigurd Ring. From an early age, he displayed the courage expected of a legendary hero. He did not wait to inherit authority peacefully. He proved himself through danger. One of the strangest stories concerns the origin of his name. Lothbrok, or Lothbrok, is usually interpreted as meaning something like shaggy breeches or hairy trousers. According to the saga, a powerful man had a daughter named Thora. He gave her a small serpent, but the creature grew until it became an enormous monster surrounding her home. Anyone who killed the serpent could marry Thora. Many warriors were frightened, but Ragnar created protective clothing by covering thick trousers and a cloak with tar and sand. Wearing these unusual garments, he approached the serpent, survived its venom, and killed it with a spear. He then married Thora and gained the name Lothbrok. The episode contains many signs of folklore. The hero defeats a monster, rescues a woman, and wins both marriage and status. It resembles older legends about dragon slayers. Historians do not treat the story as a literal account, but it reveals how later Scandinavians imagined Ragnar. He was not merely a military commander. He was a hero whose courage belonged to the mythical age. Another tradition connects Ragnar with Lagertha, the famous shield-maiden. The story appears in the work of Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish writer who composed a history of Denmark centuries after the Viking Age. Saxo describes Lagertha as a skilled female warrior who fought during a conflict in Norway. Ragnar reportedly saw her courage in battle and became determined to marry her. Lagertha, however, did not make the courtship easy. She placed a bear and a hunting dog outside her home. Ragnar killed both animals and claimed her as his wife. The story combines romance with violence and heroic testing. Lagertha may have been inspired by older legends about warrior women. Archaeological evidence shows that some high-status women were buried with weapons, but this does not prove that large numbers of women regularly served as Viking warriors. The shield maiden was also a powerful literary figure, representing a woman who entered the male world of battle. Later traditions describe Ragnar marrying Aslaug. Her background was even more legendary. She was supposedly the daughter of Sigurd, the famous dragon slayer, and Brynhild, a supernatural warrior woman associated with heroic Germanic tradition. By marrying Aslaug, Ragnar became connected to an older world of myth. According to the saga, Aslaug was raised in secrecy and traveled under the name Kraka. Ragnar heard of her intelligence and beauty and decided to test her. He ordered her to come to him, neither dressed nor undressed, neither hungry nor full, and neither alone nor accompanied. Aslaug arrived wrapped in a fishing net, biting an onion, and accompanied by a dog. She had solved every part of the challenge. Impressed by her cleverness, Ragnar married her. These stories were designed to entertain, but they also gave Ragnar an extraordinary family. Through his wives he was linked with dragon slayers, royal bloodlines, and warrior women. Through his sons, he became connected with some of the greatest Viking campaigns in history. The sagas describe Ragnar as the father of several sons, though the exact list changes between sources. The most famous were Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, Hvitserk, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. These names carried both historical and symbolic importance. Ragnar's authority was based on warfare. Like a successful Viking ruler, he needed wealth to reward his followers. He therefore launched expeditions across Scandinavia and beyond. He fought rival kings, demanded tribute, and gathered warriors around him. The historical evidence for these early campaigns is extremely weak. No contemporary source provides a reliable biography of Ragnar. However, several real 9th century events may have contributed to his legend. The most important was the Viking attack on Paris in 845. A large fleet traveled up the River Seine and approached the city. The Frankish ruler Charles the Bald gathered an army to stop them, but the defense failed. The Vikings entered Paris and received a massive payment of silver before leaving. A leader named Ragnar appears in accounts of this campaign. Because the name resembles Ragnar, some historians have suggested that Ragnar may have been a historical figure behind the legend. Yet the connection cannot be proven. The Paris raid demonstrates the kind of achievement that could create a legendary reputation. The Frankish Empire had been built by Charlemagne and remained one of the wealthiest political powers in Western Europe. For Scandinavian warriors to sail into its heartland and force a king to pay them was an extraordinary victory. News of the raid would have traveled through trading networks, royal courts, and warrior communities. The commander responsible could easily have become the subject of songs and stories. But Ragnar may represent more than Ragnar. Other Viking leaders carried similar names or performed similar actions. Over centuries of oral storytelling, their identities could have merged. The raids of one warrior might be added to the family history of another. A successful campaign in France could become part of the life of the supposed father of Viking commanders in England. The Ragnar who emerges from the sagas is therefore larger than any single historical person. He represents an entire generation of Viking expansion. His personality is defined by ambition. Ragnar never accepts that he has achieved enough. Victory in one land pushes him toward another. Even when his sons become successful warriors, he feels the need to prove that he remains greater than they are. This rivalry between father and sons becomes central to his downfall. Ragnar's children begin leading their own armies and winning their own reputations. Their fame threatens to equal or surpass his. In a heroic society, reputation could survive after death. To be remembered was a form of immortality. Ragnar, therefore, faced a terrifying possibility. Not defeat in battle, but being forgotten while his sons became more famous. His response was to attempt an expedition so daring that no one could ignore it. He would invade England with only a small force. The decision was reckless, but in the logic of the sagas, it was also understandable. Ragnar had built his identity through danger. He could not prove his greatness by choosing an easy victory. He needed to face impossible odds. As he prepared to sail, the legendary king stood at the height of his fame. He had fought monsters, married extraordinary women, challenged rulers, and fathered feared warriors. Yet the same ambition that had created his legend was now leading him toward destruction. Ragnar had spent his life pursuing glory. Soon he would discover its price. When Ragnar's story turns toward England, legend begins to overlap with one of the most important historical transformations of the 9th century. England was not yet a single united kingdom. It was divided among several Anglo-Saxon realms, each ruled by its own royal dynasty, and often involved in conflict with its neighbors. The four most important kingdoms were Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, and Wessex in the south. Smaller territories existed as well, but these larger kingdoms dominated politics. Their rivalries made coordinated defense difficult. A king might be more concerned about an Anglo-Saxon neighbor than about raiders arriving from Scandinavia. Viking commanders learned to exploit these divisions. They could attack one kingdom, accept payment, and then move against another. Northumbria was especially vulnerable. It had once been a major center of political power, religion, and learning. But by the 9th century it suffered from severe internal conflict. Rival kings competed for the throne. Rulers were expelled, restored, and killed. Civil war weakened the ability of Northumbrian leaders to respond to an external invasion. The region had already experienced one of the most famous Viking attacks in history. In 793, raiders struck the monastery of Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne was located on an island that could be reached from the mainland during low tide. It was closely associated with St. Cuthbert, one of the most respected religious figures in Anglo-Saxon England. Monks lived, prayed, and preserved manuscripts there. Valuable religious objects were stored within the community. To Christian writers were not simply robbery. It was an assault on the sacred order of the world. A monastery was supposed to be a place of peace. The killing and capture of monks created shock across Western Europe. The Vikings may not have understood the spiritual importance of the monastery, or they may simply not have cared. They saw an isolated settlement containing precious metal, food, and captives. It had little military protection and could be reached easily by ship. The raid revealed several features of Viking warfare. Speed was essential. The attackers arrived before local forces could assemble. They seized portable wealth rather than attempting to hold the territory. They withdrew before a larger army could respond. Early Viking raids were often seasonal expeditions. Warriors sailed during favorable weather, attacked several locations, and returned home with their wealth. But over time, these expeditions changed. Fleets became larger. Raiders began building fortified camps and spending the winter abroad. Their goals expanded from robbery to political control. Viking tactics depended heavily on the longship. The ships could cross open water, but their shallow hulls also allowed them to enter rivers. This meant that inland cities were not safe. A Viking army could travel directly into the interior of a kingdom, avoiding roads and many defensive positions. The warriors themselves used a range of weapons. Spears were among the most common, because they were relatively inexpensive and effective. Axes varied from small hand weapons to larger two-handed forms. Swords were prestigious and costly. A high-quality sword could be passed from one generation to another, and might be given a name. Round shields were made primarily from wood, sometimes strengthened with leather or metal fittings. Warriors could fight individually or form a wall of overlapping shields. Such formations required discipline. The popular image of Vikings as uncontrolled berserkers ignores the organization necessary for successful campaigns. Some warriors may have entered battle in states of extreme aggression, inspiring later stories of berserkers. But Viking victories were not achieved through madness alone. Commanders needed intelligence, planning, and control. They had to gather supplies, maintain ships, divide plunder, and keep rival leaders cooperating. The sagas claim that Ragnar eventually became jealous of the military success of his sons. They had begun winning victories and establishing reputations of their own. Ragnar feared that his fame would be overshadowed. He therefore decided to invade England with only 2 ships. His wife Aslaug warned him that the expedition was dangerous. A small fleet could not carry enough warriors to challenge a kingdom. Ragnar ignored the warning. The choice reveals the tragic weakness at the center of his character. Ragnar's courage had made him successful, but pride prevented him from recognizing danger. He was no longer fighting, because the campaign offered a practical advantage. He was fighting to protect his reputation. According to the story, Ragnar wore a special tunic prepared by Aslaug. The garment was believed to protect him from harm. He crossed the sea, but his ships were wrecked or destroyed near the English coast. Without his vessels, Ragnar lost the main advantage of Viking warfare. He could no longer strike quickly and escape. His small force was trapped in unfamiliar territory. King Ella of Northumbria gathered an army. Ragnar and his warriors fought fiercely, but they were heavily outnumbered. One by one, Ragnar's men were killed. Eventually, the legendary king was captured. There is no reliable contemporary evidence confirming that this battle occurred exactly as described. King Ella was a real ruler of Northumbria, but the circumstances of Ragnar's supposed capture come from much later sources. The story may have been created to explain why Ragnar's sons later attacked Northumbria. It transformed a complicated invasion into a personal revenge drama. Instead of fighting for land, silver, and political power, the sons were said to be avenging their father. The reality of Viking warfare was often more practical. Armies invaded because kingdoms were wealthy or weak. Leaders sought territory, tribute, and influence. Yet revenge was also a powerful idea in medieval society. A family that failed to respond to the killing of a relative could lose honor. By presenting the invasion as revenge, storytellers gave the campaign emotional meaning. The conflict became more than a struggle between Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons. It became a confrontation between a murdered father and the sons who inherited his duty. Ragnar's raid ended in defeat, but his defeat did not destroy his legend. Instead, it prepared the way for its greatest chapter. A successful warrior might be remembered for one generation. A warrior whose death inspired the conquest of kingdoms could be remembered forever. In the darkness of a Northumbrian prison, Ragnar faced King Ella. His army was gone, his ships were lost, and his body was in the hands of an enemy. Yet, the saga suggests that Ragnar still possessed one final weapon. He possessed the fear of what his sons would do when they learned of his death.